Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Fertility Show Let's All Talk webinar series. I'm Jessica Hepburn, an author, arts producer, and fertility patient advocate, and also your host for this evening. I hope you've been enjoying the fabulous weather we've been having if you're in the UK, as I am. Welcome if you're joining us for the first time this evening, and welcome back if you've been part of our webinar series since January. If you have been joining us, you'll know that this month we're focusing on adoption and surrogacy. The first session of the month, I was talking about adoption in the UK. And last week, my amazing co-host, Sophie Solaria, was talking to a woman about the most incredible surrogacy story. And you can watch both those webinars back on YouTube if you missed them. And tonight we're going to be talking about international adoption, and I'll introduce our guest in a wee while, but I just want to say a few housekeeping notes if I can. We've been bringing you this webinar series completely free for the last 6 months, leading up to our first ever live fertility online summit, live but online, which is going to be taking place from the 24th to the 27th of September, and tickets have just gone on sale in the last couple of weeks. And even if I say so myself, we have put together the most amazing lineup for you of over 60 of the UK and worldwide's top experts, and they will be there answering our questions and answering your questions. And if you haven't already got your tickets, then I'd really recommend you do. Tickets are just £20, and it is going to be the best money you've ever spent on your fertility journey, I can assure you. And then the Fertility Show Online Summit is leading up to our next live show, which will be taking place in May next year, where we'll have over 100 exhibitors. Many of those exhibitors will be at the online summit as well, and you'll be able to arrange meetings with them and consultations, and also loads more seminars for you. So do join us online in September, live the following May. Just one more thing before I introduce tonight's guest, which is that these events are being brought to you in association with Peanut, the social networking app, which is for women trying to conceive all the way through to motherhood. Sophie Solaria, my co-host, is an ambassador of Peanut, and you find her over in the app for many hours a day. And if you do join, it's absolutely free. Then sign up to the Fertility Show group, where you will meet lots more women like you and get lots more advice. And actually, there's another reason to sign up, which is if you do, you get 30% off your summit tickets. We're also brought to you in association with Fertility Network UK, who are the national charity supporting patients, and my own organisation, Fertility Fest, which is the world's first arts festival dedicated to fertility. So that's all the housekeeping stuff. Now let's start tonight's proceedings. This month, as I said, we're focusing on adoption and surrogacy, and I'm delighted that this evening we're going to welcome Satwinda Sandu from IAC, the Centre for Adoption, as our guest. Welcome, Satwinda. Are you out there after all my blurb?
Hi, thanks, Jessica. Thanks for that lovely welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us on what is a really hot evening. So bless you. So Satwinda, could you start by telling us, I've introduced you by name, but I'd love you to give us a bit of introduction about the Centre for Adoption, please.
Of course. So IAC, the Centre for Adoption, started its origins as a charity known as the Intercountry Adoption Centre, and so a bit like things that do what they say on the tin, we facilitate adoptions from abroad. So we're based in London, but we cover the whole of England, so we are a national charity, and we're coming up for our 25th anniversary. And one of the reasons that the charity was founded was that it was widely acknowledged in the adoption world that trying to work out the path to adopt from abroad was actually really complicated, and there was very little information around. So we started as an advice line and have over the years morphed into a fully fledged adoption agency, and now we pretty much operate anywhere where it's legally possible for UK citizens to adopt from. So we are a charity. We work with about 100 families a year, and our international partnerships, strangely enough, also include the UK. So we do place children from within the UK.
That's what I was
primarily. We are talking about children from abroad,
right.
And there's obviously a lot more I'll be saying tonight about those children and about the process.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, let's get on to the questions then. So for everyone who's watching, this is how our webinars work. I ask Satwinda 5 questions over the next 20 to 25 minutes. And then there's an opportunity for you to answer any questions that you have. We never go live to our audiences. We like to protect your anonymity, which we know is really important around the subject of fertility. So if you do have a question, put it in the Q&A function, and then Laura, lovely Laura, the managing director of the Fertility Show, will come in and she will ask our questions. She's like our voice of God. But first of all, my 5 questions. So question number 1, Satwinda, is what countries currently have children who are in need of international adoption?
So the simple answer is almost every single country in the world. And the reason for that is that most children who need to be adopted, particularly internationally, will have faced some hardship, usually pre-birth. So they may have been born to mothers who were living in really dire poverty-driven circumstances. That's often the case in some countries. There may be stigma around, for religious or cultural reasons, about children born out of wedlock. So if there's a single parent, that might be one of the reasons. But all countries that operate any kind of child protection or child welfare care system are likely to have an adoption service as part of that offer. Now, adoption has changed a lot over the years. Some countries don't operate very sophisticated adoption services. And so in relation to the UK, I mean, we have a kind of a mantra, I guess, that when people ring us or make an inquiry, they usually have an idea about where they want to adopt from. So we're led by their choice initially. If we know that that country doesn't operate a system that we recognise legally, then we will advise people of that in the first instance. So at the moment, for example, Ethiopia is no longer legally open to UK citizens because it was recognised that their system was very overwhelmed and there weren't adequate safeguards in place to make sure the children were being placed safely, and therefore at the moment that avenue is closed to British citizens. But India, the Philippines, South Africa and Bulgaria are countries we have partnerships with, and therefore there's a recognised route. So there's something called the Hague Convention, which is a legal order. And the Hague Convention is a bit like the United Nations sort of acts. And that piece of legislation was drafted to make sure that the countries operated to the same standards. So we want to obviously be sure that children who are being placed internationally by any country are legally available for adoption. By that I mean that they haven't in any way, shape or form had anything untoward. So something like trafficking rings, obviously we hear a lot about that. People will have seen the news in Nigeria about children being kidnapped from schools and then never seen again. So we have to be really sure that we're recognising a kind of like-for-like system. So any country is open. Some countries will operate in very similar ways to the UK, and that's obviously really good when that happens because it's a like-for-like equation. But most countries we can navigate people through. So it really is a question of kind of thinking about why a particular country might appeal to somebody. So at the moment, a lot of our applicants in England are people who may be from Black or other minority ethnic backgrounds. So they are sometimes choosing to adopt from countries that they have a heritage link to. So there is an understanding then about what that motivation is about. Sometimes people come to us because they've worked in a particular country. So South American countries often feature because of that, as do African countries. And sometimes there's a family link. So occasionally we have kinship applications because they need to parent a child who may have been orphaned. So the COVID pandemic sadly has created a lot of those situations. So with the recent tragedies in India, we've had a lot of inquiries from people who have nephews and nieces or other family members who've been orphaned. And at the moment, an adoption is the most likely legal route open to children like that.
Yeah. So they can't just bring the children over, even if they're even if they're linked.
Yeah, sadly, our immigration rules don't allow that.
Right, of course.
So we're starting a bit of a lobby around that because it doesn't seem right. So we're talking about very young children with nobody else to care for them. So the alternative is therefore institutional care.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that IAC exists is that we know that institutions cannot and will never be a substitute for a family, and the love and nurture that can come from being and belonging to a family that wants you and will raise you safely.
Because even presumably if those people are successful in their application, it's a long process, presumably.
Yeah, and that's the other really big issue. So those children are orphans today, and we're talking about them not potentially being able to enter the UK for another 9-12 months.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, what happens to them in between?
Yeah.
Yeah, really, really tragic.
Wow, you've already opened my eyes, and I have so many subsequent questions, but that actually does lead on quite nicely to my question number 2, which is who can adopt from abroad, and are there specific criteria? This is the thing that we had a lot of questions about this in terms of adoption from the UK in one, like, do you have to be a certain age, or or do you have to have a certain level of financial security? What's the situation?
So there are some real commonalities with adopting in the UK in terms of eligibility criteria, and there are some that are different. So the big difference is that there is no central government funding at all for inter-country adoption. So anybody choosing to adopt from abroad has to fund the process of preparation and assessment and approval themselves. Now that seems a little bit odd because actually you're not paying for any outcome. You are simply paying for IAC or another agency like ours to prepare and assess your suitability in the hope that you might be suitable.
And you might not be suitable.
You might not be. So this isn't, people sometimes think of international adoption as buying a baby. It couldn't be further from the truth. Yeah. So, and obviously it's because we're a charity, we can't operate without that income. We can't deliver those services. Yeah.
And what are we talking about? $1 million questions, sort of like what?
So to get to the point of approval, you're looking at least £15,000 to £17,000.
Right.
Then there's charges for your paperwork to be processed by the Department for Education, who are our legal central adoption authority on an international basis. And then, of course, there's the costs of travelling abroad and anything else that might be incurred as a result of legally having a process of adoption take place abroad. So sometimes it can then, the final total can be close to 30,000 or more, depending on the country. And so we work really hard to try to keep those costs down. I would love it if philanthropists gave to IAC to allow us to reduce or eliminate those charges altogether, because ultimately we are talking about a new family and safety and security and life chances for the world's most vulnerable children. So people kind of see this sometimes as driven by the parents and the families that we work with. I mean, I could speak all night about the hundreds of families I've worked with and the motivation and energy they come with and what they do for the children they end up parenting, whose lives would have tragically, been very, very different, or sometimes even cut short because of ill health or malnutrition, or the dangers that might exist in the countries that they came from. So really, really difficult circumstances. But in terms of who can actually do this, so finance is a key aspect.
So finance, you do have to blatantly,
you have to have some money.
Yeah.
And
What
so
else?
most
What else?
people that we work with usually have either saved and taken out loans or a second mortgage, things like that. So we're not talking about, gazillionaires
Yeah,
with
yeah,
lots of money to spare. So it's different for everybody, obviously. And I hate the fact that sometimes we have amazing families with great potential and who can't proceed because finance is a huge barrier.
yeah,
And obviously, their domestic adoption might be open to them because there is no charge because that is funded by the state. But sometimes, the motivation might be different to adopt from abroad, of course, as we said earlier. So many things to think about. But our job is to work and help you through it. But people who are single can adopt. We have lots of single applicants. Age is not a barrier in theory. You have to be over 21. That's the bottom line. So most people, to be honest, though, are in their late 30s, 40s, and even 50s. Often, of course, we're working with people who have had fertility issues and may have had treatment or tried other avenues to parenthood first.
yeah,
So that means, 10 years can pass
yeah,
before
yeah,
you get to us. So, but we don't see that as a problem because actually life experience, having worked through other issues that you might have been dealing with in your relationship or fertility, of course, that's all good stuff as far as we're concerned.
that's great.
And then we also work with lesbian and gay applicants. No, not all countries are open to same-sex couples or single
Right.
applicants who might be lesbian or gay because it does depend on obviously equality legislation across the globe, and in many countries it's still illegal to be lesbian or
Yeah.
gay, so that of course is a non-starter. But there are many countries like Colombia, South Africa, who warmly welcome members from the community. So people who aren't married, so if you're just cohabiting and living together or in a civil partnership, that's not a barrier. The only real barrier to adoption is severe ill health. So if you are dangerously, ill and unlikely to recover or likely to be dependent on someone, that often is a contraindication to be able to parent a child.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and if you have had any criminal convictions that might be classified as a risk to children, that's a non-starter.
yeah,
So police
absolutely.
checks are a standard part of our requirements at the beginning of the process. And sadly, we know that sometimes people do get through the system, and that's not what we want. And so it really, and of course, you have to have space, emotionally and physically.
Yes.
And the adoption requirements, regulations, so the law requires that adopted children have a bedroom of their own.
Yeah.
Now that seems like a real luxury, especially in families where there may be lots of children who've grown up sharing bedrooms. But part of the thinking behind it is that, this is a child who you won't necessarily know. So particularly if you're adopting an older child, it is different to giving birth to a child and knowing them from the minute they were conceived.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And so it feels like it's a little bit safer. It's not always a barrier, but usually it is.
yeah,
So there are some practical things, and that sometimes means that it can feel as though you've got to be fairly well off and middle class to adopt, which again isn't strictly true. But I can't deny that there's an element of that because people have to be able to afford international adoption. But there isn't anybody who really can't adopt unless you tick some of those no-nos that I've mentioned.
yeah, yeah. And what's brilliant about your answer, Satwinda, is that it's really you're really clear. And I think people watching this, they want to know, because like you say, it's a big, with international adoption, it's a big financial investment. You've been honest about that. But any form of adoption is a big emotional journey to go on. And it might not be successful at the end of it. So people want to know what the parameters are.
Yeah.
So sort of off the back of that, can you talk us through the process, which I understand from our first, but I'd love you to talk it through in your eyes, but I understand from our first webinar that it's not totally dissimilar from going through the process in the UK.
It's not. So there's lots of similarities. The point of approval usually where things get a bit different. So our research has shown that often people think about adoption for over 2 years before they pick up the phone or fill in a web form to inquire. So it's a huge emotional step that people are taking. And so my teams are hopefully skilled and sensitive to acknowledge that. And therefore, even if we're speaking to somebody who doesn't know anything about the process, our job is to guide you through it.
Yeah.
So the inquiry process is really important because that's the first time you'll make contact with an adoption agency. It might be IAC, it might be another charity, it might be a local authority service, but hopefully the responses will be fairly similar.
Yeah.
And our job at that stage is really to talk you through what the steps will be and who the children are and what's required of you. So the stuff we've been talking about in terms of eligibility is part of that first discussion.
Yeah.
And it's really a case of then we would at IAC invite people then on to a webinar a bit like this. Before the pandemic, it probably would have been in person, but actually the webinars mean we can reach people from much more further afield, which is great. So that first webinar will be about the process, about international adoption, what it involves, what IAC does, what the overseas agencies do, who the children are, what support's available, the whole process. And often we'll have an experienced adopter and sometimes children come on and talk about what it's been like for them, because that makes it real for people. And then we'll invite people, if they're still wanting to consider this route, to make a formal application. So if people hear about a registration of interest, that's what the formal application is. And then the adoption agency has to evaluate and respond to that within 5 working days. And then if that ROI is accepted as a formal application, we will then trigger what's known as stage 1. So stage 1 really is about checks and balances and preparation. So we will write to referees who you will choose. We'll write to family members just to find out who's in your support network. We'll ask you to tell us about your health. We'll do the checks with local authorities and police and that sort of practical stuff. And we'll also invite you to a preparation course. And that's a really important step in this, because I've seen people come to preparation courses feeling really nervous, a bit unsure, and a bit clueless. And then at the end of those 3 days, which we're now managing virtually, and they don't all run concurrently, so you've got some breathing space, people have met other people in the same position, they've made new friends, they've learned a lot about adoption, a lot about themselves. And then once stage 1 completes, which usually takes about 2 months, you're then ready for stage 2, which is your assessment. So that will see you spend some time with a social worker who's basically your advocate. And we're not here to find problems and trip people up. It really is about helping you learn and grow. And then that takes people to the point of approval. Now that's the point where domestic and intercountry adopters then go on a separate path.
Right.
Because our intercountry adopters will then have their paperwork processed by the Department of Education, as I said earlier, and then sent abroad to the country of choice. And then that country will then usually evaluate the paperwork and think about the children on their waiting lists. And then hopefully at some point, usually it takes at least a year, unfortunately, because there is a lot of children and a lot of families, and therefore it's kind of like it's not strictly a queue, but there has to be some method to the matching, because it's about trying to find the right fit for children and families. And then you'll at that point be able to travel abroad once your paperwork's authorised and meet the child, spend time with them, bring them to your temporary home, and then go through the legal adoption process. Usually that happens overseas, and then apply for your visa and bring them home. And then we will be there to answer questions, support you, guide you. So our mantra is adoption is for life, and so is our support. So we will always be there as long as we exist at the end of a phone or an email.
It's amazing. Thank you so much for talking through that. A couple of questions have sprung to mind off the back of that. So do you choose one country? I mean, as part of the process,
Yes.
I know you said earlier, Satwinda, that some people come knowing what country they want to adopt from, but presumably some don't. Do you settle on one country, or is there ever a scenario whereby you're applying to 2 countries?
So
one supplementary question.
Yeah. At the moment, the law requires that you choose a country and then are approved for that country. So in those early stages, before the formal application's even made, we will help you work that out. So if you are truly open to any country, we'll talk about the options and what might be a good fit for you, sort of children, if you want an older child, a younger child, a baby, where's that likely to happen?
Yeah.
As I said, many people do already know, or if they don't know, they've kind of got close to making a decision.
Yeah.
But as you're then going through the process and being approved, we have to specifically approve you for a country.
Yeah.
And the only reason that would then change is if something happens where that country perhaps might temporarily close, or you decide actually to change your mind, or you want to convert to the UK and do a domestic adoption. But that's all stuff that we can manage. But yeah, it is a country.
And my second supplementary question is, do these countries, I mean, are they really open to adoption from abroad, or would they rather keep these children in their own country, adopted by their own citizens? I mean, is there a...
It's a bit of both, I think, Jessica, to be honest. I think, all things being equal, most countries would prefer to have enough adopters domestically that could take the children in need in their care. But we know that some countries are overwhelmed by poverty, and therefore it just simply isn't possible, even with large populations.
Yeah.
In some countries, adoption is a little bit of a stigma, and so it's not as culturally acceptable as it is in the UK, and so therefore it's not as straightforward always.
Right.
And so therefore, when children are being placed abroad, they have to be legally made available for a list of children that are going to be placed abroad.
Yeah.
But people don't do that begrudgingly.
Yeah.
They understand that this is going to be best for the child, and they make sure then that they do their best to find the right family for them.
Yeah.
And of course, we work really hard to make sure that children don't lose links with their country of origin, that they grow up with a sense of their identity, especially if they're being adopted by a family who might be of a different background or cultural ethnicity.
Well, I want to come on to that, because that is my third question. So I just want everyone that's listening to know that those two other questions that I just asked weren't part of my 5. They were supplementary. But also, this is a good opportunity for me to say, if you do have any questions out there, do put them in the chat box, because this is an amazing opportunity. I could ask you questions all night, but we're here to answer your questions too. So do let us know. So oh no, sorry, this is my 4th question now. I tell a lie, I've done 3. Yeah, which is, what sort of specific needs to children? I mean, I'm sure that there isn't a uniform answer, because there isn't a uniform child, but are there specific needs that you would want to flag up to people, and what might be the difference between adopting children from abroad and adopting children from the UK? Because one of the things that we heard in the first session is, obviously, the majority of, well, if not all the children who are being adopted in the UK have come from very, very difficult starts in life. I mean, and of course that's the same, I'm sure, but maybe those difficult starts look slightly differently.
Yeah, they are slightly different, not always, but usually. So abroad, you're looking at children who will have spent the early part of their childhood in institutions, so children's homes or orphanages. In the UK, most of our children, almost all of them, are in foster homes, so they're with families, and that is a big difference. So a child growing up in institutional care often won't have had the one-to-one nurture. Sometimes feeding is an issue. They may have physical delay in terms of their development. So 99% of the time they catch up, because children are amazingly resilient and just thrive when they get this one-to-one attention and care. Sometimes it's a medical issue, if the resources don't exist in the orphanage to access simple medical care sometimes. So stuff that we might think of as routine in England, and I know there's lots of criticisms about waiting times for operations and GPs, but it's a world away from what happens in some of these other countries where there's just no access at all. So sometimes it's those sorts of things. So a family might not have been able to care for a child that was born with a minor ailment, and therefore think that it's better that they give them up for adoption because they'll have hopefully a better life. And people don't always understand, of course, that the impact of a child being separated from their birth mother can have an emotional trauma and legacy that we just don't understand.
Yeah, and is equal to a physical trauma. Yeah.
And so I think anybody adopting, whether it's abroad or in the UK, has to accept that the child that they will be parenting will have experienced that separation and loss, and therefore could have some resilient trauma. Even if there's no actual trauma involved, at some point the child has to understand their background and come to terms with their identity as an adoptee. So our philosophy is, you have to do that repair work right from day one. Adoption is something you talk about. There's lots of great books now out there that help children build a really great self-esteem as adopted children. But the needs can range, for anything from behavioural to, as I said, medical, eating, sleep patterns. Sometimes, of course, when a child is coming from a different country, just really simple stuff can be difficult at first. So language, noise, smells, environment,
Yeah.
the cold British weather.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not today, of course, but it is. There's lots of things like that, and our job is to make sure you can't prepare for every eventuality, but there are certain things we see repeatedly. So those themes we will focus on in preparation groups, and social workers will be on hand to advise you. Now, the other bit of that in terms of children's needs is adopters must always feel they can reach out for help. You aren't in this alone. If you choose to adopt from IAC, you become part of our extended family, and there will always be somebody there that you can lean on and call on, even if it's just for half an hour and you want to sound off about a difficult day. So because once children start to get older and they're in school, or you adopt other children, they have siblings, these problems can manifest in different ways. So actually, as I was saying earlier, adoption is for life. Things don't stop just because you have an adoption order or your child is now a teenager or an adult. This is just part of your identity now as a family. And I think my advice is just embrace it and join the community who are out there.
And
my experience is adoptive parents love nothing more than being called on for advice and support, because they have done it and they don't want people to have to recreate the wheel if they don't need to.
Yeah. And you started to say, as part of the previous question, about this sort of connection with your birth country and sort of, maintaining that in some way. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I mean, that's a thank you for reminding me, Jessica, because it's not sometimes explicitly seen as a need that a child comes with, but of course it will be.
Yeah.
So again, that loss that can come with culture and loss of your kind of native tongue and the environment you're raised in, even if you're living with a family who comes from the same background, that is not the same. So again, children need to know what their history and heritage is. And a child who is, let's talk about a Black South African child coming to the UK, they will have a very different experience growing up in England, of course, than they would have had growing up in South Africa. And for one thing, there will be far fewer people with the same skin colour and that look like them. So the whole thing about making a positive identity and developing that alongside your identity as an adoptee, alongside that development of identity that we all have to go through as young people and adults, I suppose it's kind of doubled or tripled in some ways. So adopters, again, in terms of support and what we try to impart in terms of learning is just, again, reaching out for support and getting hold of resources and knowing how to help your child build that positive self-identity, how to help them know that they were wanted and loved, and that actually adoption, whilst there may be some loss involved, is something really amazing and positive and embracing, and something they can be proud of.
Yeah, absolutely. And talk to me a little bit, this sort of covers two questions really, this question I've just asked and a previous one, like what are the views around, or the things one needs to think around if you're adopting from a different religious background? I mean, can you adopt from different religious backgrounds or ethnic backgrounds? What are the possibilities or the no-nos?
So I think the possibilities are endless in reality, because children need families, and that is the best place for them. And so if there's not a perfect match in terms of ethnicity, culture, language, religion, then our job is to identify first and foremost what's the difference, what are we talking about here. So and then being really clear about, well, what does that look like going forward? So if you are a Catholic family and you are adopting a child who was born into a Muslim family, even if they were non-practicing, meaning the child wouldn't have been necessarily raised as a Muslim, if they would have been raised within a culture and an awareness of that heritage and what that culture might mean. So actually, you don't have to become a practicing Muslim just because you are an adopter.
Yeah.
It's about an openness. And in cities like London, we're really fortunate because you are surrounded by diversity on your front door. But the further you move away from cities, the less diverse areas are. So actually, if your child is the only child of colour or the only child, in your family that is of a different skin colour or ethnicity, then that has to be something that's acknowledged.
Yeah.
The worst possible thing, and we say this because many, many adoptees who are now adults tell us this from their own experience. I heard somebody in an international conference just 2 weeks ago saying, I loved my parents, they loved me, I knew I was wanted, but the fact that my skin colour was different to theirs was never discussed.
Right. Yeah.
So I grew up with a sense of trepidation about my black skin that didn't need to exist, because actually it just needed to be something that we spoke about and acknowledged. And actually, if I came home upset from school because somebody was calling me names, I needed to be able to go to my mum and her understand what that meant.
Yeah.
So, and now there's so much literature out there about dealing with race, racism, ethnicity, identity development. So again, we work really hard to make sure that adopters are open to that. So I really feel that if you come to adoption, you've got to be a bit like a sponge.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not only are you going to take on the child and embrace them wholeheartedly, but you've got to take on everything about them. And one analogy I loved very early on in my career was when we think about who's important to us in our families, often you will think about people who have passed away, people you don't see very often, people who might live abroad and you never see. And it's the same for adopted children. Just because they belong to a new family who are claiming them and loving them and nurturing them and just thinking they're the best thing on earth, they do still have a history and heritage out there that exists. And every now and then they will be curious, and the best parents possible, when there's been an adoption, will just be comfortable and go with that, because I can't think of one example where that's happened, but it's led to anything other than a more fulfilled relationship between the parent and child, one that's honest and authentic and able to deal with slightly emotional, prickly stuff as well as all of the easy stuff that we have day to day.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. And I think it's like we all want to know where we came from, like
it's just human nature.
Yeah, it's just human nature. But unfortunately, it's also human nature to be find communication around difficult subjects. Human beings aren't brilliant at doing that either, which is why it's brilliant that you're saying this, because communication is key, isn't it? Honesty and openness is what leads to most healthy human beings. Right, it's my fifth question, and then we're going to go to the audience. I've been hogging you. Has COVID, you touched on this earlier, but it must have thrown up issues, COVID, because none of us are able to travel, right?
So obviously, when we have over 100 families waiting, ready to travel abroad because they've been on waiting lists for a year, and you're getting closer to the top, that there's a child there, it's meant huge emotional stuff. So we've had, just before the pandemic, we had a family who were linked to a child in Thailand, a little girl who they'd been waiting for 4 years already.
Oh.
And then Thailand closed their borders, and the family weren't able to travel for another 12 months. And 12 months out of a young child, out of anyone's life, is a huge time. But for a toddler, that child who was 2 was now 3. And so that's the reality of what COVID has done. And then we've had other families who just have been in agony because they just feel that they can't cope with another year of waiting. Mm. So if you imagine, some of the people on the webinar may be, in this group themselves, when you've had 3, 4, 5 years of medical infertility investigations and treatments, and perhaps, really sad other life events, and then you go to an adoption process and you're looking at your end, which is a family, and then suddenly something like this happens. Of course, the pandemic's been life-changing for everyone, but for me, working closely with adoptive families, it's just made me reach into a really deep well of empathy.
Yeah.
Because there's very little that anyone can do. Nobody can open borders. Nobody, and of course, when countries were closing down, adoption services were closing down alongside everything else. So not only was there travel restrictions, but matches weren't being made, but that didn't mean children weren't in need. That's the sad reality. And as I said earlier, the pandemic in some countries has meant there's more children in need. Yeah. So it's devastating as the reality. But on a more positive side, because we've all been, those of us who have the luxury of having, homes and families and loved ones to be with, it's also created in us a real sense of urgency around what family means. It's reminded us of those relationships that we take for granted. So for a lot of people who are currently now going through stage 1 and stage 2 with IAC, these were people who were on the fence.
Yeah.
I want to adopt. I'm thinking about it, but 2025, I'll think about it.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, it was like kind of a wake-up call. What am I waiting for? So if I'm going to do this, let's just get on and do it. So actually, our numbers of inquiries and applications hasn't dropped at all.
Yeah.
And in domestic, I know when I talk to my peers in domestic adoption teams and services, inquiry numbers in the UK from people thinking about domestic adoption have, in some cases, trebled.
Right.
So I think it has given people that sense of urgency that actually our lives aren't limitless. We have to make things happen.
Yeah.
And unless people pick up that phone or get in contact with an adoption agency, this application won't miraculously just begin itself. Yeah. So there's good stuff that has come out of it, because I think for me that means hopefully more amazing families for all these really vulnerable children who desperately need you.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I mean, it is heartbreaking, but yeah, that is a call to arms as well. To start the process. Laura, I know we haven't had a huge number of questions, but I think you've got a question that we were both discussing after the first session. So why don't you jump in and ask your question, and then I've got a couple of final questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, a question is, for international adoption, do you look into the history of the person who wants to adopt in terms of their previous partners? We heard last week that in the UK, some agencies do go and interview previous partners and relationships. Is that the case with your agency?
So it's a legal requirement. It always feels a little bit odd.
Intrusive, odd, yeah. Actually. Odd is a better word.
It is intrusive, you're absolutely right, Jessica, but it's odd. But I tell you, the reason we have to do this is we are taking at face value what people tell us. And sometimes that has to be corroborated by people in the applicant's network, so siblings, parents, partner, and sometimes that extends to ex-partners. Now, policies do vary. So at IAC, we will only ask for an ex-partner interview or reference if you have lived together and had children. So, and that sometimes extends to if you've not lived together but have a child together. because we have had examples where something has come up that just sparks something that's a little bit worrying, and of course we have to take that alongside a pragmatic view that sometimes ex-partners might not want what's best for you as the applicant. So this is one piece of evidence. So it's like a jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah.
You've got 1,000 pieces. This is worth about 3 pieces.
Yeah.
So a good social worker will be able to put together the whole picture and make an assessment and not take things out of context.
And actually, Satwinda, you've described that brilliantly, because I think when Laura and I were discussing it post the last session, we're thinking, like, did they go back to someone you went out with like 15 years ago, for 1 month or something? No. But actually, by saying if you've shared a child or you've
it's a significant relationship we're talking about here.
That absolutely does make sense. Thank you, Laura. Has that answered your question, Laura?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
I think we could be competing with A, the weather in this seminar, and also B, the fact that lockdown restrictions have been eased this week. Yes. But we always ask a secret 6th question, which I'm going to ask you in a minute, Satwinda, but I wanted, since I've got you, and I am absolutely loving this conversation and find it absolutely fascinating. Can I ask you sort of a bit of a controversial question, I suppose? We hear a lot about these celebrity adopters, the Angelina Jolie, the Madonna, who've done a lot for adoption on the one hand, with their rainbow families, but on the other hand, there's quite a lot of criticism of them as well. And obviously, clearly, the financial aspects aren't a problem for them. Yeah. What your sort of, can I ask cheekily, what's your view on these sort of celebrity adoptions?
Well, as an adoption advocate and someone who passionately believes in adoption for children, I do think it's a good thing to have that level of profile.
Yeah.
The criticism in my world tends to be more about the process, because sometimes it feels as though they're allowed to cut corners because of who they are or because of the wealth that they might have. Madonna being able to adopt in a matter of months when it takes other people 2 or 3 years. How did that happen? Is everything kind of legal and legitimate? Yeah. The reality of part of this is a lot of high-profile celebrity adoptions are done by Americans, and the American adoption system is very different.
Right, okay.
So it varies state by state. So even though Madonna was living in London and married to a Brit at the time she adopted her first son, she adopted through the American route because she was still a US citizen and was legally able to. And the reality is it's a much faster and a much different process. Now, some might say it's not as in-depth and therefore not as safe or whatever you want to call it. But, it's a way to adopt. And of course, it's US law is down to the US government. Who are we to say what's right and wrong? But I think for me, there is, I can see why people do view it sometimes through a slightly negative lens, because it does paint this kind of concept of creating a family of different ethnicities and races and children a little bit out of context. But, these are children who will have been on the same lists of waiting children as the ones I'm talking about. So for them to have those opportunities, and of course, being adopted by a celebrity brings with its own pressures, as well as all of the positives that might, it bring to your life and the opportunities it brings. So, but I think, I don't have a problem with it per se, but I do sometimes wish that people would also adopt, through the domestic route. But there are lots of examples of US celebrities who, they have adopted children through the foster care system rather than the international route. Yeah. So of course that again brings different challenges, but people don't differentiate. You see Sandra Bullock with 2 children who are different skin tone to her. You wouldn't know whether they had come from foster care or from abroad. And I think in her case, it was through foster care.
Right, yeah.
So I think there's a spectrum of, I guess, views, and mine's, I guess, somewhere sort of on the more positive end overall.
Yeah. And what's, I think, really brilliant listening to your answer to that question is that, you know, essentially it's grey, isn't it? There is no black and white. And it's actually really important for us to hear that, you know, from someone who is an expert, who's, you know, as you said, worked 20 years at the face of international adoption. So I really value your honest answer to that. Now, I'm going to ask you my secret sixth question, and then we can wrap up. Unless, Laura, you're going to shout at me that we've got any final questions, but it's just been so brilliant, this interview. And if you could offer one piece of advice to someone thinking about international adoption, perhaps thinking about international adoption in the time of COVID, what would it be?
I think it's, you know, aside from thinking about the financial aspect, which is an important part, as I said right at the start, just to reach out to your local adoption agency or to IAC and find out more, because actually adoption is like anything. Unless you might be thinking it's something you want to consider, but until you find out more, you won't know if it's actually right or wrong for you. And as I said, you know, there are millions, and you know, it's a sad state of affairs. There are millions of children who are legally classified as orphans, and these are children who could be adopted into families. And my, you know, passion is about making that happen. So if we could double or treble our numbers, you know, I would be ecstatic about that, because every time a child is adopted from abroad, if it's done in a well-supported way where access to support is truly lifelong, then it can be amazingly transformative. So a lot of people who, when they become parents, say it completely changes their lives. Of course, it brings lots of sleepless nights and exhaustion and worry and the rest of it, but it's transformative. And I think the more people that would choose adoption as their first route to parenthood, and not simply as an alternative or because infertility has got in the way of planning, I think that again would be an amazing thing, because we're in a, you know, there's lots of talk about the world being in crisis because of the climate, because of sustainability, and for me, adoption is the greenest route to parenthood. It's the most sustainable. And I would love everyone that can think about being a parent just to think about it seriously.
That's beautifully put, because and also just links into like one of my passions, which is fertility education. And what I really want to see is a society where we get educated early on about all the different routes to parenthood, and adoption being one and biological parenthood being another, and exactly as you say, it being the greenest route to parenthood. And such a valuable and important one. Thank you so much, Satwinda.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Interview you, and you know, everybody that's listening and watching tonight, this interview will be available on YouTube, so you can catch up afterwards. Let me just say, don't forget to download the Peanut app for free and join the Fertility Show group, because why? You get 30% off your Fertility Show Summit tickets. Please also join, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the social channels, because that's how you hear about all our events. And we'll be announcing the lineup for the summit, which is amazing, as I said earlier. And my lovely co-host Sophie will be back here next week with another session on surrogacy. And this actually is our penultimate Let's All Talk Fertility webinar, because in August we'll be taking a break, and Sophie will be putting together the best of webinars of 2021, and then we'll be back in September for the summit. Join us there. Satwinda, thank you so much.